On November 19th, 1983, police made a horrifying discovery in a shallow grave in White House, Ohio. Inside, they found 19-year-old Janine Brown's body, nearly naked. As investigators dug deeper, secrets began to surface, and the suspicion fell on 4 people. Yet the investigation struggled to move forward. It would take 30 years, countless twists, and one pivotal clue to finally solve the case. On November 18th, 1983, the quiet village of White House, Ohio, received chilling news. A woman out in the early morning for a jog had seen blood splattered in the fields a few miles away from where Janine and Pam had lived. As the woman turned to leave, thinking it was a wild animal being slaughtered, something else caught her eye. Horrified and quite certain now that something terrible must have happened here, the lady started to walk along the trail in the mud marked by drag lines, starting from where the panties lay and leading toward the forest. As she reached a space where a lot of leaves and mud were dumped, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A foot visible from underneath all that mud. She immediately called 911 and gave them the details of what she'd seen. Within a few minutes, the police arrived at the scene to start their investigation. Upon their arrival, what the police saw at the crime scene left them horrified and speechless. They decided to hand over the case to the county deputies, and when the county deputies arrived at the scene, they were led by veteran detective Daryl Symington. The makeshift grave was just a couple of feet deep, and dead leaves were placed all around and on top of the body. When all the dirt from the body was removed, it was recognized to be the body of a female. The forensic team began photographing the victim while the detective carefully examined the numerous bruises on her body. As the investigation proceeded further, the detectives found other pieces of clothing belonging to the victim and also a pair of Merit cigarettes. Since the body was found to be naked upon its discovery in the makeshift grave, the investigators decided to bring in a rape kit. Testing confirmed that the victim had been taken advantage of. The forensics team began collecting evidence from the crime scene, including the victim's hair sample, blood, and traces of male bodily fluid left on the body. However, in doing so, the detectives discovered another horrifying secret. Upon inspecting the body, they realized that Janine was asleep before her death. As the investigation stretched on, the detectives started to formulate rough ideas of what might have happened to this woman. News of the horrific discovery of a woman's body started circulating among the village as anxious people waited to know what had happened and who the killer was. Unfortunately for the detectives, they still didn't know the identity of the victim. Thus, they started to hunt for information related to the victim using a method of elimination. They began looking through the recently filed missing persons reports in hopes of finding one that matched the description of the victim, and soon enough, they did. Investigators had soon come across a report filed by a woman named Pam Ratter. Upon reviewing the details of Pam's report, detectives identified the victim as 19-year-old Janine Brown. Her family was then contacted and informed that Janine's body had been found. A thorough investigation began in order to bring justice to Janine and catch the perpetrator. The detectives, determined to find the culprit as soon as possible, had made a list of people who were close to Janine or had interacted with her on the night of her disappearance. The first person called to the interrogation room for questioning was Pam Ratter. Pam was devastated by the news of her best friend being found murdered. She told the detectives that she wanted them to catch the culprit, and for that, she was willing to provide them her full cooperation. When the detectives questioned Pam about the events leading to Janine's disappearance and eventual murder, she provided every little detail about Janine to the detectives. 19-year-old Janine Brown lived in the small agricultural town of White House, Ohio. White House was a village back in the 1980s, and the community was close-knit and helpful. However, it had not been ready for the events that were about to unfold on the night of November 17, 1983. Janine and Pam had been best friends since childhood. After completing her graduation, they had bought a house and started living together, along with Pam's brother, Larry Ratter. Janine took up the job of a nurse, aiding the elderly and people in need of assistance. She always used to talk about how she loved her job and enjoyed helping other people. She had no difficulties going to the nursing home since it was quite close to her house. Being teenagers, Janine and Pam took pleasure in doing typical teenager activities like going to the bar in the evening. The girls were regulars at the only bar house in the small village, Copper Lantern. However, on November 17, 1983, when the two girls decided to visit the bar like any other typical Thursday night, terrifying events awaited them that would change their lives forever. Larry, Pam's brother, had also accompanied the girls to the bar. Upon entering, the girls greeted their other friends who were already present there. The girls met with Bill Heisinger, also popularly known as Crazy Horse, and Janine's boyfriend, Harold Big Dog Estep. The couple had been dating for almost a month, and everyone in the community knew about and supported their relationship. Andy Gustafson, who knew everyone in White House, was also present. He was the village's resident rich kid. Born with a silver spoon in his mouth, he made sure everyone knew how heavily packed with money he was. To add on to that, he used to tip the bartenders handsomely and even treat other attendees of the bar to a few beers. At 12:30, the mood pivoted from playful to strained when Andy had made a provocative remark about Janine's physique, complimenting her on having a cute butt. When Harold heard the comment, he was immediately enraged. Harold was known around the village for his extreme anger issues. He'd often pick fights when his anger flared, and the moment he heard Andy's comment, he became furious and ready to confront Andy. However, this incident didn't escalate into a fight, as everyone at the bar, including Janine, urged him to ignore Andy's remarks, knowing he had a reputation for making inappropriate comments about girls. As the clock hit 2 a.m., everyone was asked to leave the bar since it was closing time. Janine bid Harold goodbye and promised to meet up the following day for a date, and then went out with Pam. However, she stopped right at the front of the bar and turned around to tell Harold something when she saw the sight in front of her that made her blood boil. Furious, she stormed away from the bar, not even waiting to hear Harold's explanation. Pam and Janine had then gotten into their friend's car, who had offered them a ride home. But when the two girls entered their house and took off their jackets, Janine looked desperate. She told Pam that she wanted to confront Harold immediately and was not willing to wait till morning to go and meet him. When Pam woke up the next morning and didn't find Janine in her room, she assumed that Janine might have decided to stay at Harold's place for the night. As the hours passed and it was time for Janine to go to work, her absence became alarming. Pam knew something was wrong because this was very unlike Janine. This prompted Pam to call Harold and ask if Janine had overslept and wasn't planning to go to work. However, when Harold answered her call, his response sent chills down Pam's spine. With anxiety and panic, Pam rang Janine's brother to ask if she'd gone home instead last night. Pam had started to get restless and decided to call the police. She filed a missing persons report, giving them all the necessary details about Janine, but the police informed her that it was still too soon to launch an investigation. Frustrated, Pam started walking around every possible place that Janine could be at, hopelessly trying to find her best friend. Pam's statement about Janine leaving the house to confront Harold when she saw him kissing the barmaid gave the detective their first suspect, Janine's boyfriend, Harold Estep. The detectives began by interrogating Harold since they believed he might have a possible motive. He could have wanted to get rid of her for the barmaid Loretta, or might have simply killed her in a fit of rage. Upon being questioned, Harold told them what had happened on that fateful night. Harold told the detectives that after he left the bar, he didn't meet up with Janine. Instead, he went to his sister's house just 2 blocks away from Copper Lantern. Harold was a strong suspect, even though he kept denying that he had any involvement in the murder. Thus, to verify his alibi, the detectives decided to question his sister where he was staying on the night of the murder. His sister's testimony would unravel another complex layer in the investigation. The sister testified that Harold had come to stay at her place that night and that no one else had visited, which confirmed his alibi. Having no evidence against Harold, the detectives had no choice but to let him go. The next person the detectives questioned was the barmaid Loretta. She told detectives her version of the events that took place that night. Loretta's side of the story was accepted by the detectives because they believed she couldn't have committed the crime alone. They had a theory that since Janine was assaulted before her death, one of the parties involved had to be a man. Yet Loretta was still under the detectives' radar. The forensic report revealed that the stab wounds found on Janine's neck were inflicted by someone who knew their way around knives. This clue made the detectives go through the people present in the Copper Lantern that night. One person that caught their attention was Bill Heisinger, also known in the village as Crazy Horse. Bill knew a lot about knives and how to handle them, and being a survivalist, he always had a knife with him. Bill told the detectives that he had indeed gone to the Copper Lantern that night, but had left for home when the bar closed. Bill lived alone and had no one to confirm his alibi. Thus, detectives were left with an open-ended suspect. The detectives added Bill to the suspect list, but they weren't ready to face another chilling twist that was about to be discovered. There was another person that caught the eye of the detectives, Larry Rader, Pam's brother. When the detectives ran a quick check on the man living with Janine along with his sister, a shocking truth was revealed. When Pam was told about Larry being a suspect, she kept defending her brother, saying that there was no reason for him to kill Janine. But detectives had a theory that Larry might have committed this murder out of jealousy when Janine had started dating Harold. With Pam confirming Larry's alibi, the detectives had no choice but to let Larry go as well. Additionally, their theory that he'd killed Janine out of jealousy didn't hold up. As the detectives reached a dead end, a shocking turn of events altered the course of their investigation. A witness named Chester came forward to testify about what he'd seen on the night of Janine's disappearance. Pam told the detectives that whomever had picked Janine up must not have been driving her home, since the place where Chester and Janine had interacted was just a few minutes away from their home. Therefore, whomever had picked her up might have offered her a ride to Harold's place, but they never made that trip. The detectives started to cross-check who among the people in the bar that night knew or interacted with Janine and owned a truck. Among the list of suspects, one name came forward: Andy Gustafson. Andy told the detectives that he'd been drinking at Copper Lantern, but had gone straight home at around 3 a.m. His wife confirmed his alibi, raising further doubts for detectives, especially since Chester had told them he saw Janine get into a van at around 4 a.m. When Andy was called to be interrogated again by the detectives, he hired an attorney and refused to cooperate. The detectives knew they had to find another way. They decided to start with Andy's van, hoping it might provide some clues about his involvement in the murder, and obtained a search warrant for the same. Just when the detectives were about to give up, thinking the van held no clues, the forensics team made a startling discovery. They found a few used cigarettes that belonged to the same brand that Janine used to smoke, Merit cigarettes. However, the detectives still couldn't get a hold of Andy to question him about the new findings. With no further evidence to pursue and the technology at the time unable to determine if Janine had smoked the cigarettes, the detectives found themselves at a dead end once again. As no perpetrator was identified and all suspects were released due to the lack of concrete proof, the case eventually went cold. For years, Janine Brown's best friend Pam never gave up on finding justice for her. Her tireless campaigns in order to raise awareness and seek justice was a driving point when the case was reopened 3 decades later in June 2013. Detectives Jay Gast and Tom Ross from the Cold Case Department had taken over the case. By this time, the detectives had an upper hand in the case due to the advancements in science. DNA genealogy was a powerful tool at their disposal to aid in their investigation. The detectives went back to the 4 main suspects that were neither arrested nor cleared of suspicion of their involvement. They knew that if any of the 4 were responsible, one swab of DNA would help identify the perpetrator. The first person the detectives decided to interrogate was Bill Crazy Horse Heisinger. He had a notorious reputation back in the 70s, and not much had changed over the years. When the detectives approached him, he showed no surprise when they mentioned Janine and began answering their questions without any hesitation. Bill was cooperating well with the detectives, but when he was asked to narrate the events of that night, he pointed out something baffling to the detectives. The detectives wanted to verify this information, but his statement lacked the clarity that the detectives sought, leaving them with more questions than answers. But now the detectives had Bill's DNA. They decided to wait for the results before accepting any other theory, suspecting that he might have made the story up because he was guilty and had felt threatened. The next person to be questioned was Larry Rader, Pam's brother, who had dated Janine in the past and still had strong feelings towards her. However, when the detectives had gone to interview Larry, they encountered another roadblock. Doing a background check, the detectives also found out how Larry had once passed out drunk on Janine's grave. They requested a DNA sample to be collected from Larry's remains. His family had been horrified by the request, but decided to aid in the investigation because they knew of Larry's innocence. Thus, 27 years after the murder of Janine Brown, the forensics obtained Larry's DNA sample, which they sent to the lab for further analysis. The detectives now turned their attention to the next suspect, Janine's then-boyfriend, Harold Estep. The last suspect to be interrogated by the detectives was the village's rich kid, Andy Gustafson. When the detectives asked for a DNA sample to be collected, Andy did something unexpected that only made the detectives grow more suspicious. Andy hired an attorney and then told the detectives that he was not at all willing to give his DNA sample to be tested. This immediately made Andy go up the suspect list. Before the detectives could dig any further, the other results came back from the lab. The DNA of all 3 suspects, Larry, Bill, and Harold, did not match the DNA found on Janine's body, and they were finally cleared off the suspect list after 30 years. The detectives thought they'd hit a roadblock when Andy refused to provide his DNA sample. However, hope was reignited when a piece of evidence found in Andy's file gave them a new lead: the Merit cigarette found inside his van. When the detectives sent it to the lab for testing, the results provided them with a crucial breakthrough. The DNA present on the cigarettes matched with the DNA of Janine Brown. Andy was interrogated once again as detectives wanted to see if he'd confessed to the fact that Janine had indeed been in his van on the night of her murder. Just as the police were losing hope, a major breakthrough came that would finally aid them in closing the case of Janine Brown. Detective Kathy Strouksbury, a renowned detective from the Sheriff County, called the investigating detectives, saying that she could help the detectives out. After taking his DNA sample from Detective Kathy, it was sent to the lab for testing. When the results came back, the detectives had a solid answer. Andy Gustafsson killed Janine Brown. His DNA was a match, and Andy was immediately arrested in May 2013. Even though Andy didn't speak, the detectives had a theory as to what might have happened on the night of the murder. Andy's failed attempt to approach Janine only fueled his desire to have her more. When he saw her walking down the road, Andy did offer Janine a ride at around 4 a.m., just like Chester had seen. The pair might have shared a friendly smoke until Andy started approaching Janine in a manner she didn't welcome. Janine must have fought hard against his advances, resulting in him dragging her to the woods and hitting her with his belt. He then proceeded to take advantage of her, but fearing his arrest, took the knife and slit her throat, almost decapitating her. Then he must have gone back home and manipulated his wife into thinking that it was around 3 a.m. when he returned, so she'd support his alibi. When Andy's case went to trial, his attorneys knew they couldn't fight against DNA evidence. Therefore, Andy decided to take the plea deal. On December 28, 2014, Andy Gustafsson pled guilty to felony manslaughter and felony rape in the first degree. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison for involuntary manslaughter and 5 years for rape. Janine's friends and family finally got the answer as to what had actually happened to the free-spirited, lively girl on the night of November 17, 1983.